The city of Alton had seen its fair share of controversies, but what unfolded on a cool October evening would send shockwaves through its core. The air was heavy with the crispness of fall, and the streets were unusually quiet, the orange glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Somewhere on the east side, in a neighborhood that had seen better days, an incident was about to occur that would unravel secrets, challenge prejudices, and force one man to face the weight of his choices. Officer Daniel Harrington prided himself on his no-nonsense approach to policing. A veteran on the force, he carried himself with an air of authority that often crossed the line into arrogance. Daniel had grown up in a household where his father's harsh views had shaped his own outlook. To him, the world was divided into us and them, and he believed firmly in the stereotype-laden rhetoric he'd been taught. On this particular night, Daniel was patrolling alone in his squad car when a call came through his radio. A suspicious individual was reported near Jefferson Avenue, a predominantly black neighborhood. The voice on the radio mentioned a man loitering near a corner store, and Daniel's prejudice took over. Without hesitation, he responded to the call, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the steering wheel. When he arrived, his headlights illuminated a solitary figure in a wheelchair. The man, dressed in a worn hoodie and jeans, was parked near the edge of the sidewalk, looking at the closed store's window. His face was calm, yet there was a deep weariness in his eyes, as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. Daniel stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the pavement. The man looked up but didn't flinch, his gaze steady. "Hey!" Daniel barked. "What are you doing here?" The man's voice was quiet but firm. "Just waiting for my ride." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Your ride? At this hour? In this neighborhood?" He circled the wheelchair, his presence looming over the seated man. "You got ID?" The man sighed and reached into his jacket pocket. His movements were slow, deliberate, but Daniel's hand instinctively went to his holster. "Easy," the man said, his tone tinged with exasperation. He pulled out a wallet and handed it over. Daniel flipped it open and scanned the ID. Marcus Green, born 86. That makes you 37? He raised an eyebrow, scrutinizing the man as if looking for a reason to escalate. "That's right," Marcus replied. "You got a record, Marcus?" "No," Marcus said flatly. But Daniel wasn't satisfied. His suspicion grew, fueled not by evidence, but by his own deep-seated biases. He leaned in closer. "What's a guy like you doing out here? You don't look like you belong." Marcus's jaw tightened. "I live 3 blocks away. Not that it's any of your business." The response hit a nerve. Daniel's temper flared, and before he realized it, he grabbed Marcus by the collar, yanking him forward. "Watch your tone with me," Daniel hissed. "Let go of me," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. Daniel's grip tightened, but as he looked into Marcus's eyes, something strange happened. For a brief moment, he felt a flicker of unease, an unshakable feeling that he'd seen this man before. The altercation was escalating quickly. A small crowd began to gather at a distance, their phones out, recording the interaction. Marcus noticed them, but remained composed. "You're making a mistake," Marcus said calmly. Daniel laughed, a hollow, humorless sound. "Is that a threat?" "No, it's a fact," Marcus said, his voice carrying an authority that Daniel couldn't ignore. Before Daniel could respond, the sound of sirens cut through the air. Another squad car pulled up, and out stepped Captain Elijah Harrington, the commanding officer of the precinct, and Daniel's son. Elijah was everything Daniel wasn't. Where Daniel ruled through fear and intimidation, Elijah led with compassion and respect. His rise through the ranks had been swift, driven by his sharp mind and unshakable integrity. As Elijah approached, his eyes locked onto Marcus, and his expression shifted from professional concern to shock. "Marcus?" Elijah's voice was filled with disbelief. "Hey, Eli," Marcus said, his tone softening. Daniel froze. His son knew this man? The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. "Dad," Elijah said sharply, turning to Daniel. "What are you doing?" "I'm handling a situation," Daniel replied defensively. "No, you're not," Elijah snapped. "Step away. Now!" Reluctantly, Daniel released his grip and stepped back, his confusion growing. "Elijah," He began, "You know this guy?" Elijah ignored him, crouching down to Marcus's level. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," Marcus replied. "Your timing, as always, is impeccable." Elijah smiled faintly before turning to the crowd. "All right, folks, thank you for your concern. You can head home now." The crowd dispersed slowly, murmuring among themselves, but the phone stayed pointed until the last possible moment. As the tension eased, Daniel pulled Elijah aside. "What's going on here? How do you know that man?" Elijah's expression darkened. "Marcus is a friend, a family friend, and a good man. Whatever you think he's done, you're wrong." Daniel's mind raced. He couldn't reconcile what he was hearing. He opened his mouth to argue, but stopped when Marcus spoke. "Tell him, Eli," Marcus said, his tone unyielding. Elijah sighed, running a hand through his hair. He turned to Daniel, his eyes hard. "Marcus is my godfather." The words hit Daniel like a freight train. "What? How? Why didn't I know this?" "Because you never cared to ask," Elijah said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Marcus has been there for me since I was a kid. He's the reason I'm the man I am today. And tonight, you treated him like a criminal, like less than human." Daniel stared at Marcus, his mind spinning. Memories surfaced, distant and fragmented. He remembered the name now, though it had been years. Marcus had once been a promising athlete, a local hero who had stood for everything good in their community. But a tragic accident had left him paralyzed, and Daniel had never spared a second thought about what had happened to him after that. "You're him," Daniel said slowly. "That's right," Marcus replied. "And you're the same man you've always been. Quick to judge, quick to hate." The words stung, but Daniel couldn't deny their truth. Elijah stepped between them. "Dad, you've always said you wanted me to be the best. Well, Marcus taught me what that means. Being the best isn't about power or control. It's about justice, compassion, and integrity. Maybe it's time you learned that too." For the first time in years, Daniel was at a loss for words. As the night wore on, the three men remained at the scene, the silence between them heavy with unspoken truths. But in that silence lay the first glimmers of understanding, a chance for redemption, if only Daniel had the courage to take it. The following days felt like a blur for Daniel Harrington. He had returned home after the encounter with his son and Marcus, his mind racing, unable to shake the images of what had unfolded. The guilt gnawed at him relentlessly, biting at the edges of his consciousness. He found himself replaying the moments over and over. How he had reacted to Marcus, how his assumptions had clouded his judgment, how he had mistreated someone he now realized was a part of his own family story. It wasn't just about Marcus, though. It was about Elijah, his son, the one person Daniel had always believed he could guide, mold into his own image. But Elijah had defied him. He had chosen a path of compassion over his father's rigid, hardened ideals. Elijah's relationship with Marcus, a man Daniel had dismissed for so long, was a reflection of everything Daniel had failed to see in his own son. And in that realization, something deep within him cracked open. The next morning, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, staring blankly at his half-finished coffee. His mind wandered back to the many years he had spent as a police officer, upholding a code of conduct that had been, in his mind, unimpeachable. But as he reflected, the truth became undeniable. His code was flawed, steeped in prejudice, and built on a foundation of fear. Fear of change, fear of the unknown, fear of being wrong. He had risen through the ranks of the police force by following the rules, by holding firm to his beliefs. But those beliefs had been shattered in an instant. What was it all worth if it meant alienating his son, alienating the very people he had sworn to protect? Daniel wasn't sure where to begin, but he knew he had to make things right. The sun was beginning to set when Daniel pulled up in front of Marcus's modest house. It had taken him a few days to gather the courage to make the drive, but now that he was here, he felt a sense of urgency gnawing at him. He knocked on the door and waited, the sound of his heart pounding in his chest. When the door opened, Marcus stood in the doorway, his wheelchair positioned just inside. He regarded Daniel with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Officer Harrington," Marcus said coolly, "what brings you here?" Daniel swallowed, his throat dry. I came to apologize. Marcus's eyebrows furrowed, clearly taken aback. Apologize? For what? For the way I treated you, Daniel replied, his voice strained. For assuming the worst, for judging you before I even knew your story. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. There was a long pause. Marcus studied him intently, as if trying to determine if this was a genuine apology or just another round of hollow words. Finally, he nodded, his expression softening. I appreciate that, Marcus said, his voice calm yet firm. But it's not just about me. It's about what you believe, about who you think you are, and who you think the rest of us are. Daniel nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. He had spent so many years defining the world through his own narrow lens. But now he saw the cracks in that worldview, the harm it had caused, and worse, the damage it had done to his relationship with Elijah. I've been a fool, Daniel admitted. I spent my whole life thinking I knew what was best, but I never took the time to truly see what was right in front of me. Marcus's gaze softened. We all have our blind spots, but the real question is whether or not you're willing to open your eyes. Later that evening, Daniel found himself sitting in his living room, his eyes fixated on the old family photos hanging on the walls. He could hear the sounds of Elijah's footsteps approaching, the soft thud of his boots on the hardwood floor. When Elijah entered the room, his face was unreadable. For a moment, neither father nor son spoke. Then Daniel stood up, a sense of urgency in his movements. Elijah, we need to talk. Elijah's brow furrowed. About what? I know I've let you down, Daniel began, his voice thick with emotion. I've been so wrapped up in my own way of thinking that I never really saw you for who you are. But I see it now, and I'm sorry. Elijah remained silent, his expression unreadable. Daniel's heart raced. I've made a lot of mistakes, son, Daniel continued, his voice breaking. But I want to change. I want to be the father you deserve, the father I should have been. Elijah's eyes softened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a flicker of something resembling hope in his gaze. Dad, Elijah's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. You're not perfect. You never were. But I've always wanted you to see me for who I am, not who you want me to be. Daniel swallowed hard. I know, and I failed you. I'm not asking you to be perfect, Elijah said. I'm asking you to be real, to face the truth, no matter how hard it is. You've got to reckon with the things you've done and the people you've hurt, and only then will you truly be free. The next morning, Daniel met with his captain, Elijah's superior at the precinct. The conversation was difficult, full of awkward pauses and tense exchanges, but in the end, it was cathartic. Daniel knew he couldn't erase the damage he had caused, but he was ready to take responsibility for it. And so, as time passed, Daniel's life began to shift. Slowly but surely, he worked to mend the relationships he had damaged, especially the one with his son. Elijah's unwavering support allowed Daniel to begin confronting his own demons, to unlearn the prejudices that had been ingrained in him for so long. But even as he made progress, Daniel understood that redemption wasn't an instant fix. It was a journey, a long, difficult, and often painful one. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel found himself in a position he had never imagined, working alongside Elijah and Marcus to bridge the gaps in their community. It was a humbling experience, and one that forced Daniel to confront the true meaning of justice, compassion, and family. The more time he spent with Marcus, the more he realized how wrong he had been. Marcus had become a symbol of strength, resilience, and redemption. A man who had overcome not only physical barriers, but also the systemic injustices that plagued his community. It was through Marcus's example that Daniel began to understand what true leadership looked like. But there was one moment, one encounter, that would change everything for Daniel. It was a chilly morning when Daniel found himself standing on a crowded street corner, watching as Marcus addressed a group of young men and women. Marcus's words were powerful, his voice steady, as he spoke about the importance of community, of standing up for one another, and of fighting for a better future. Daniel stood in the back, quietly observing, his heart swelling with pride. He had never imagined that this man he had once so wrongly judged, would become a leader in their city, a force for change. But here he was, standing side by side with Marcus, knowing that their shared journey was just beginning. As the crowd dispersed, Marcus approached Daniel, a knowing smile on his face. "You've come a long way, Officer Harrington," Marcus said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. Daniel nodded, the weight of the past lifting from his shoulders. "No more masks, Marcus. I'm ready to see the world as it really is." And with that, Daniel understood. This was just the beginning of his own redemption. The days following that moment felt like a rebirth for Daniel Harrington. His life, once controlled by rigid beliefs and prejudices, had been cracked wide open, and now, as he stood on the other side, he could feel the weight of the change. There was no turning back now, not after everything he had seen, learned, and come to understand about himself, his son, and the man he had wronged. The work ahead would be far from easy, but Daniel was ready to face it. A few weeks after his conversation with Marcus, Daniel found himself back at the precinct, his precinct, where he had spent the last 2 decades of his life, a place that now felt foreign. It wasn't just the physical environment that felt different, it was his very perspective on it. The uniform he wore, once a symbol of power and authority, now felt like a reminder of everything he had to prove, both to the world and to himself. His relationship with Elijah was healing, but it wasn't perfect. There were still difficult conversations and moments of tension, but those moments were the stepping stones of a new beginning. Daniel knew he had to prove he wasn't just talking about change. He had to live it every single day. He had to show Elijah, show Marcus, and most importantly, show himself that he was capable of real transformation. One afternoon, after a long shift, Daniel found himself alone in his office. The precinct was quieter than usual, and for once, the noise of the world outside seemed distant. He stared at the framed photograph on his desk, the one of him and Elijah when he was a boy, full of pride and innocence. A faint memory stirred, one of a time when everything had seemed simpler, when he had been a father in his son's eyes and not just a distant figure. The door creaked open, and Daniel looked up to find Captain Elijah Harrington standing in the doorway. The younger man's posture was relaxed, but there was a seriousness in his eyes. Daniel felt the weight of his son's gaze, and he knew this conversation was inevitable. "I need to talk to you," Elijah said, stepping inside. Daniel stood up, feeling a mix of anticipation and dread. "What's on your mind?" Elijah hesitated before speaking. "Dad, I know we've been through a lot, and I know you're trying, but I need to ask you something. Something important." Daniel nodded, his heart pounding. "Anything?" Elijah met his gaze, his voice soft but firm. "Do you really believe you can change? Not just for me, not just for Marcus, but for yourself? Do you believe you can unlearn everything you've been taught?" The question hit Daniel like a cold wave, and for a moment he was lost in thought. The truth was he wasn't sure, but one thing was certain: he had to try. He owed it to his son, he owed it to Marcus, and most of all, he owed it to himself. "I have to believe I can," Daniel said, his voice steady but unsure. "I can't undo the past, but I have to try. I have to make amends." Elijah studied him for a long moment, and then, slowly, he nodded. "I believe you can, Dad, but it's not going to be easy. There are people who will never forgive you for what you've done. There are people who will never see you as anything but the man you were." Daniel swallowed hard, his chest tightening. "I know, but I can't live in the shadows of my past anymore. I have to face the consequences of what I've done, and I have to try to make things right. Starting with you. I can't change the world overnight, but I can start with us." There was a long silence between them, the weight of their words hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Elijah took a step forward, his eyes softening. "I'm proud of you, Dad," Elijah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm proud of you for finally seeing what's in front of you. But I need you to know, it's not just about what you do now. It's about who you become and who you choose to be moving forward." Daniel nodded, the tears threatening to rise, but he held them back. "I won't let you down again, Eli. I promise." For the first time in what felt like years, the walls between father and son began to crumble. Elijah stepped forward, embracing his father with a strength that Daniel had longed for. The embrace was tight, full of emotion, years of pain, hurt, and misunderstandings woven into the moment. But there, in that quiet office, was the seed of hope, a chance for them to rebuild what had been broken. The following weeks were a turning point for Daniel. He began working closely with Marcus, learning from him not just as a community member, but as a man who had endured and triumphed in ways Daniel had never considered. Marcus's strength was quiet, but undeniable, and his resilience sparked something in Daniel that had been dormant for far too long. As the two men worked together, Daniel found himself immersed in the community he had once shunned. He began attending meetings, speaking with residents, and listening to their stories. It wasn't easy. There were still many who resented him for his past actions, for the ways he had failed them. But Daniel didn't shy away from their anger or their judgment. He faced it head-on with humility and a willingness to learn. And slowly, the walls began to come down, not just between him and the community, but between him and his own conscience. Daniel wasn't perfect, but he was committed to the work. He began mentoring younger officers, showing them that justice didn't come from fear or control, but from understanding, empathy, and respect. But it wasn't just the work that changed. Daniel's relationship with Elijah continued to grow. The father and son began spending more time together, something they hadn't done in years. They played basketball at the local gym, shared meals, and talked long into the night about their dreams and their fears. They learned to trust each other again, to communicate without the barriers of judgment and shame that had once defined their relationship. There were still moments of tension, moments when old habits threatened to resurface, but they faced them together. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. One day, Marcus invited Daniel to a community gathering in the park. It was a celebration, a way for the neighborhood to come together, to heal, and to acknowledge the progress they had made. As Daniel walked through the park, he felt a sense of belonging that he had never experienced before. The faces around him were familiar now, not just from his work as a police officer, but from the relationships he had built, the people he had come to know. As he approached the stage, Marcus spotted him from across the field and gave him a nod. Daniel felt a quiet sense of gratitude and awe. Marcus had become more than just a friend. He had become a teacher, a mentor, and a reminder of the power of second chances. At the front of the crowd, Elijah stood with his arms crossed, watching his father. He didn't need to say a word. His eyes said it all. They were no longer just father and son. They were partners in something far greater than themselves. And for the first time, Daniel knew that redemption wasn't a destination. It was a journey he would walk for the rest of his life. The crowd cheered as Marcus took the microphone, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. But it wasn't just the words he spoke that resonated. It was the man he had become, the man who had stood against the odds and come out stronger for it. And in that moment, Daniel understood something deeply. Redemption wasn't just about doing the right thing. It was about becoming the right person, and maybe